Hey, homegirl or homeboy. I am Kiani, the responsible homegirl, and I am so excited to be here. Today is my first time going live on YouTube, so it's going to be really, really, really exciting. I actually need to, I hope that you all can hear me fine because I have this mic plugged in. But for those of you who have been rocking with me as far as I'm not even gonna say as far as, but since 2025, the start of this new year, I started a series called Financial Books to Read, and the first book that we're reading is called The Psychology of Money. The book is actually right here, and we've been making some great leeway in this book. However, I've been a little off track, so we're going to hop back into it. And today we are going to read chapters 4 through 6 together. And then after, I'm thinking going live and doing our financial books to read. Essentially, our book study is going to be our thing that we do together on live. So if you have any questions, comments, make sure you drop them in the comments. I wish I could see the comments from here as I'm going live, but I can't. But yeah, let's hop into it. One sec. Y'all gotta bear with me. This is my first time doing this. I really should have had it bookmarked already. Okay, chapter 4. Chapter 4, Confounding and Compounding. 81.5 billion of Warren Buffett's 84.5 billion net worth came after his 65th birthday. Our minds are not built to handle such absurdities. That is absurd. That is crazy. You mean to tell me the majority, like the vast majority of his wealth came after his 65th birthday, when we live in a time right now where we want to be multimillionaires before we turn 30? That's crazy. So now let's start with chapter 4. Lessons from one field can often teach us something important about unrelated fields. Take the billion year history of ice ages and what they teach us about growing your money. Now, I've read this before, so just stick with me because I'm not a science girl. And if you're not a science person, this could kind of go over your head, but just stick with it because it makes sense at the end. Our scientific knowledge of Earth is younger than you might think. Understanding how the world works often involves drilling deep below its surface, something we haven't been able to do until fairly recently. Isaac Newton calculated the movement of the stars hundreds of years before we understood some of the basics of our planet. It was not until the 19th century that scientists agreed that Earth had on multiple occasions been covered in ice. There was too much evidence to argue otherwise. All over the world sat fingerprints of a previously frozen world, huge boulders strewn in random locations, rock beds scraped down to thin layers. Evidence became clear that there had not been one ice age, but five distinct ones that could be measured. The amount of energy needed to freeze the planet, melt it anew, and freeze it over yet again is staggering. What on earth, literally, could be causing these cycles? It must be the most powerful force on our planet. And it was, just not in the way anyone expected. There were plenty of theories about why ice ages occurred. To account for their enormous geological influence, the theories were equally grand. The uplifting of mountain ranges, it was thought, may have shifted the Earth's wind enough to alter the climate. Others favored the idea that ice was the natural state, interrupted by massive volcanic eruptions that warmed us up. But none of these theories could account for the cycle of ice ages. The growth of mountain ranges or some massive volcano may explain one ice age. It could not explain the repetition of five. In the early 1900s, a Siberian scientist named Milton Mekwovok studied the Earth's position relative to other planets and came up with the theory of ice ages that we now know is accurate. The gravitational pull of the sun and moon gently affect the Earth's motion and tilt toward the sun. During parts of this cycle, which can last tens of thousands of years, each of the Earth's hemispheres gets a little more, a little less solar radiation than they're used to. And that is where the fun begins. Milkovac's theory initially assumed that a tilt of the Earth's hemispheres caused ravenous winters cold enough to turn the planet into ice. But a Russian meteorologist named Vladimir Kopin dug deeper into his work and discovered a fascinating nuance. Moderately cold summers, not cold winters, were the icy culprit. It begins when a summer never gets warm enough to melt the previous winter's snow. The leftover ice base makes it easier for snow to accumulate the following winter, which increases the odds of snow sticking around in the following summer, which attracts even more accumulation the following winter. Perpetual snow reflects more of the sun rays, which exacerbates cooling, which brings more snowfall, on and on. Within a few hundred years, a seasonal snowpack grows into a continental ice sheet, and you're off to the races. The same thing happens in reverse. An orbital tilt, letting more sunlight in, melts more of the winter snowpack, which reflects less light in the following years, which increases temperatures, which prevents more snow the next year, and so on. That's the cycle. The amazing thing here is how big something can grow from a relatively small change in conditions. You can start with a thin layer of snow left over from a cool summer that no one would think anything of, and then in a blink of an eye, the entire earth is covered in miles thick ice. It is not necessarily the amount of snow that causes ice sheets, but the fact that snow, however little, lasts. So, the big takeaway from ice ages is that you don't need tremendous force to create tremendous results. Again, I told y'all, stick with me. It's starting to make sense now. The big takeaway from ice ages is that you don't need tremendous force to create tremendous results. If something compounds, if a little growth serves as fuel for future growth, a small starting base can lead to results so extraordinary they seem to defy logic. It can be so logic defying that you underestimate what's possible, where growth comes from, and what it can lead to. And so it is with money. More than 2,000 books are dedicated to how Warren Buffett built his fortune. Many of them are wonderful, but few pay enough attention to the simple fact. Buffett's fortune isn't due to just being a good investor, but being a good investor since he was literally a child. So this man has been investing for years and years and years and years. As I write this, Warren Buffett's net worth is 84.5 billion. Of that, 84.2 billion was accumulated after his 50th birthday. 81.5 billion came after he qualified for Social Security in his mid 60s. Warren Buffett is a phenomenal investor, but you miss a key point if you attach all of his success to investing acumen. The real key to his success is that he's been a phenomenal investor for 3/4 of a century. Had he started investing in his 30s and retired in his 60s, few people would have even heard of him. Consider a little thought experiment. Buffett began serious investing when he was 10 years old. By the time he was 30, he had a net worth of 1 million or 9.3 million adjusted for inflation. What if he was a more normal person, spending his teens and 20s exploring the world and finding his passion, and by age 30 his net worth was, say, $25,000? And let's say he went on to earn the extraordinary annual investment returns he's been able to generate, about 22% annually, but quit investing and retired at age 60 to play golf and spend time with his grandkids. What would a rough estimate of his net worth be today? Not 84.5 billion, 11.9 billion. Sorry, 11.9 million. So, with that example they gave, right now his net worth is 84.5 billion. But say for instance, he started at 30 and he retired at 60, his net worth would be 11.9 million. So 99.9% less than his actual net worth. Effectively, all of Warren Buffett's financial success can be tied to the financial base he built in his adolescent years and the longevity he maintained in his geriatric years. His skill is investing, but his secret is time. So the earlier you start investing, the better. Something that I'm always preaching, something that I read about, something that I've learned so much about. Like, that is the key with compound interest. That's the key with just investing in general. The earlier you start, the better, because time is literally the secret to success. So they say here, that's how compounding works. Think of this another way. Buffett is the richest investor of all time, But he's not actually the greatest, at least not when it's measured by average annual returns. Jim Simmons, head of the hedge fund Renaissance Technologies, has compounded money at 66% annually since 1988. No one comes close to this record. As we just saw, Buffett has compounded at roughly 22% annually, a third as much. Simon's net worth, as I write, is 21 billion. He is, and I know how ridiculous this sounds given the numbers we're dealing with, 75% less rich than Buffett. Why the difference if Simon is such a better investor? Because Simon did not find his investment stride until he was 50 years old. He's had less than half as many years to compound as Buffett. If James Simon had earned his 66% annual returns for the 70-year time span Buffett has built his wealth, he would be worth, please hold your breath, and y'all, this is a big number, 63 quintillion, 900 quadrillion, 781 trillion, 780 billion, 748,160,000. These are ridiculous and practical numbers. The point is that what seems like small changes in growth assumptions can lead to ridiculous and practical numbers. And so when we are studying why something got to become as powerful as it has, why an ice age formed, or why Warren Buffett is so rich, we often overlook the key drivers of success. I have heard many people say the first time they saw a compound interest table or one of these stories about how much more you have in retirement if you begin saving in your 20s versus your 30s changed their life. But it probably didn't. What it likely did was surprise them because the numbers intuitively didn't seem right. Linear thinking is so much more intuitive than exponential thinking. If I ask you to calculate 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 in your head, you can do it in a few seconds. It's 72. If I ask you to calculate 8 times 8 times 8 times 8 times 8 times 8 times 8, your head will explode because that is 134,217,728. IBM made a 3.5 megabyte hard drive in the 1950s. By the 1960s, things were moving into a few dozen megabytes. By the 1970s, IBM's Winchester drive held 70 gigabytes. Then drives got exponentially smaller in size with more storage. A typical PC in the early 1990s held 200 to 500 megabytes, and then wham, things exploded. In 1999, Apple's iMac comes with a 6 gigabyte hard drive. Now, if we get a computer today that only holds 6 gigabytes, we will lose our mind. My phone has 256 gigabytes right now, and every day I'm deleting something because I'm out of storage. So it's just crazy to see how things have grown and just stuff has just evolved over time. So 2003, 120 gigs on the Power Mac. 2006, 250 gigs on the new iMac. 2011, a 4 terabyte hard drive. 2017, a 60 terabyte hard drive. 2019, 100 terabyte hard drives. Crazy. Put that all together, from 1950 to 1990, we gained 296 megabytes. From 1990 through today, we gained 100 million megabytes. If you were a technology optimist in the 50s, you may have predicted that practical storage would become 1,000 times larger, maybe 10,000 times larger. If you were swinging for the fences, few would have said 30 million times larger within my lifetime. But that's what happened. The counterintuitive nature of compounding leads even the smartest of us to overlook its power, meaning that compounding is so powerful that sometimes we even discount how powerful compounding is. In one of my old videos, I told you all that compound interest and just compounding in general, it's not like multiplication, like 3 times 3. It's more like exponents, 3 to the third power. We know that, like, let's just say 3 times 2. 3 times 2 is 6, but 3 to the second power is 9. So when you do that with much larger numbers, you understand that compounding has so much more power when you compare it to exponents versus you looking at it as multiplication. So the counterintuitive nature of compounding leads even the smartest of us to overlook its power. In 2004, Bill Gates criticized the new Gmail, wondering why anyone would need a gigabyte of storage. Author Stephen Levi wrote, despite his currency with cutting edge technologies, his mentality was anchored in the old paradigm of storage being a commodity that must be conserved. You never get accustomed to how quickly things can grow. The danger here is that when compounding isn't intuitive, we often ignore its potential and focus on solving problems through other means. Not because we're overthinking, but because we rarely stop to consider compounding potential and its power. None of the 2,000 books picking apart Buffett's success are titled, This Guy Has Been Investing Consistently for Three-Quarters of a Century. But we know that that's the key to the majority of his success. It's just hard to wrap your head around the math because it just doesn't make sense. There are books on economic cycles, trading strategies, and sector bets. But the most powerful and important book should be called Shut Up and Wait, something that is so hard for all of us to do. It's just one page with a long term chart of economic growth. The practical takeaway is that the counterintuitiveness of compounding may be responsible for the majority of disappointing trades, bad strategies, and successful investing attempts. You can't blame people for devoting all their effort in what they learn and what they do, to trying to earn the highest investment returns. It intuitively seems like the best way to get rich. But good investing isn't necessarily about earning the highest returns, because the highest returns tend to be one off hits that can't be repeated. It's almost like it's outliers. It's about earning pretty good returns that you can stick with and which can be repeated for the longest period of time. That's when compounding runs wild. The opposite of this, earning huge returns that can't be held on to, leading into some tragic stories, we'll need the next chapter to cover them. So, what that paragraph really just tells me is that consistency is the name of the game. You have to find what works and repeat it over and over and over and over again instead of just looking for lack of better terms, like these one hit wonders that we think are going to take us from 0 to 1 million overnight. No, be okay with slow and steady winning the race. Be okay with finding something consistent and consistently doing that for years and years and years over time, because you can see from Warren Buffett's story, it's not that he has done something, so super special, super unique. Yes, he's a great investor, but what has really worked for him is the time that he's been investing. The literally years on top of years. This man has been investing since 10 years old. So just remember that as you are starting your investment journey and just really anything in life. So, next, chapter 5, getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. Good investing is not necessarily about making good decisions, it's about consistently not screwing up. There are a million ways to get wealthy, and plenty of books on how to do so. But there's only one way to stay wealthy, some combination of frugality and paranoia. And that's a topic we don't discuss enough. Let's begin with a quick story about two investors, neither of whom knew the other, but whose paths crossed in an interesting way almost a century ago. Jesse Livermore was the greatest stock market trader of his day. Born in 1877, he became a professional trader before most people knew you could do such a thing. By age 30, he was worth the inflation adjusted equivalent of $100 million. By 1929, Jesse Livermore was already one of the most well known investors in the world. The stock market crash that year, that ushered in the Great Depression, cemented his legacy in history. More than more than a third of the stock market's value was wiped away in an October 1929 week, whose days later whose days were later named Black Monday, Black Tuesday, and Black Thursday. Livermore's wife Dorothy feared the worst when her husband returned home on October 29th. Reports of Wall Street speculators committing suicide were spreading across New York. She and her children greeted Jessie at the door in tears, while her mother was so distraught she hid in another room, screaming. Jessie, according to biographer Tom Rubithon, stood confused for a few moments before realizing what was happening. He then broke the news to his family. In a stroke of genius and luck, he had been short the market, betting stocks would decline. You mean we are not ruined? Dorothy asked. No, darling, I have just had the best ever trading day. We are fabulously rich and can do whatever we like, Jessie said. Dorothy ran to her mother and told her to be quiet. In one day, Jesse Livermore made the equivalent of more than $3 billion. During one of the worst months in history of the stock market, he became one of the richest men in the world. As Livermore's family celebrated their unfathomable success, another man wandered the streets of New York in desperation. Abraham Germansky was a multi-millionaire real estate developer who made a fortune during the roaring 1920s. As the economy boomed, he did what virtually every other successful New Yorker did in the late 1920s: bet heavily on the surging stock market. On October 26, 1929, the New York Times published an article that in two paragraphs portrays a tragic ending. Bernard H. Sandler, attorney of 225 Broadway, was asked yesterday morning by Mrs. Abraham Jermansky of Mount Vernon to help find her husband, missing since Thursday morning. Jermansky was 50 years old and an East Side real estate operator, was said by Sandler to have invested heavily in stocks. Sandler said he was told by Mrs. Jermansky that a friend saw her husband late Thursday on Wall Street near the stock exchange. According to her informant, her husband was tearing a strip of ticker tape into bits and scattering it on the sidewalk as he walked toward Broadway. And that, as far as we know it, was the end of Abraham Jermansky. Here we have a contrast. The October 1929 crash made Jesse Livermore one of the richest men in the world. It ruined Abraham Jermansky, perhaps taking his own life. But fast forward 4 years after the stories crossed paths again. After his 1929 blowout, Livermore, overflowing with confidence, made larger and larger bets. He wound up he wound up far over his head in increasing amounts of debts and eventually lost everything in the stock market. Just greedy. Broke and ashamed, he disappeared for 2 days in 1933. His wife set out to find him. Jesse L. Livermore, the stock market operator of 1100 Park Avenue, missing and has not been seen since 3 p.m. yesterday, the New York Times wrote in 1933. He returned, but his path was set. Livermore eventually took his own life. The timing was different, but Jermansky and Livermore shared a character trait. They were both very good at getting wealthy and equally bad at staying wealthy. Even if wealthy is not a word you apply to yourself, the lessons from that observation apply to everyone at all income levels. Getting money is one thing, keeping it is another. And oh my gosh, I feel like I preach this more than anything. I literally made a Facebook post earlier just sharing a little bit about my story. And I told them back in 2019 when I was facing eviction, I learned very quickly that money without management is completely useless. Because you will look at your money, you will think, oh, I got thousands of dollars, I'm working this job. Or even in my case, I had a $7,000 refund check, I was working two jobs. You could not tell me, my 20-year-old self, that I wasn't rich, or 21 at the time, I wasn't rich, that I wasn't balling out of control. Okay, girl, you balling all right. You got this money, but no management skills. And because you don't have management skills, your money is literally sitting in your checking account waiting for it to be spent. So I'm going to just read this one more time. Getting money is one thing, keeping it is another. If I had to summarize money success in a single word, it would be survival. As we'll see in chapter 6, 40% of companies successful enough to become publicly traded lost effectively all of their value over time. The Forbes 400 list of richest Americans has, on average, roughly 20% turnover per decade for causes that don't have to do with death or transferring money to another family member. Capitalism is hard, but part of the reason this happens is because getting money and keeping money are two different skills. And in my personal opinion, I think that keeping money, money management, is the harder skill to learn because we have to learn how to be disciplined. We have to learn how to be patient. We have to learn how to go against just our human nature of wanting things instantly. So, getting back to the book, getting money requires taking risk, being optimistic, and putting yourself out there. But keeping money requires the opposite of taking risks. It requires humility, yes, and fear that what you've made can be taken away from you just as fast. It requires frugality and an acceptance that at least some of what you've made is attributable to luck, so past success can't be relied upon to repeat indefinitely. Moritz, the billionaire head of Sequoia Capital, was asked by Charlie Rose why Sequoia was so successful. Moritz mentioned longevity, noting that some VC firms succeed for 5 or 10 years, but Sequoia has prospered for 4 decades. Rose asked why that was. Moritz said, I think we've always been afraid of going out of business. Rose, really? So is fear only the paranoid survive? Moritz, there's a lot of truth to that. We assume that tomorrow won't be like yesterday. We can't afford to rest on our laurels. We can't be complacent. We can't assume that yesterday's success translates into tomorrow's good fortune. Here again, survival. I get the logic behind this, but I don't necessarily subscribe to like just having this fear-based mentality. I do understand, I do believe that you have to plan for downfalls, you have to plan for things not always going your way, but I don't necessarily agree with the fact that you have to, live in this just survival state of mind. So getting back to the book, here again, survival, not growth or brains or insight. The ability to stick around for a long time without wiping out or being forced to give up is what makes the biggest difference. This should be the cornerstone of your strategy, whether it's in investing or your career or a business you own. There are two reasons why a survival mentality is so key with money. One is the obvious. Few gains are so great that they're worth wiping yourself out over. The other, as we saw in chapter 4, is the counterintuitive math of compounding. Compounding only works if you can give an asset years and years to grow. It's like planting oak trees. A year of growth will never show much progress. 10 years can make a meaningful difference, and 50 years can create something absolutely extraordinary. But getting and keeping that extraordinary growth requires surviving all the unpredictable ups and downs that everyone inevitably experiences over time. We can spend years trying to figure out how Buffett achieved his investment returns, how he found the best companies, the cheapest stocks, the best managers. That's hard. Less hard, but equally important, is pointing out what he didn't do. Warren Buffett didn't get carried away with debt. He didn't panic and sell during the 14 recessions he lived through. He didn't sully his business reputation. He didn't attach himself to one strategy, one worldview, or one passing trend. He didn't rely on others' money. Managing investments through a public company meant investors couldn't withdraw their capital. He didn't burn himself out and quit or retire. He survived. Survival gave him longevity, and longevity investing consistently from age 10 to at least age 89 is what made compounding work wonders. That single point is what matters most when describing his success. To show you what I mean, you have to hear the story of Rick Guerin. You've likely heard of the investing duo of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, but 40 years ago, there was a third member of the group, Rick Guerin. Warren, Charlie, and Rick made investments together and interviewed business managers together. Then Rick kind of disappeared, at least relative to Buffett and Munger's success. Investor Manish Paraby once asked Buffett what happened to Rick. Manish recalled, Warren said, Charlie and I always knew that we would become incredibly wealthy. We were not in a hurry to get wealthy. We knew it would happen. Rick was just as smart, but he was just in a hurry. What happened was that in the 1973 to the 1974 downturn, Rick was levered with margin loans, and the stock market went down almost 70% in those 2 years. So he got margin calls. He sold his Berkshire stock to Warren. Warren actually said, I bought Rick's Berkshire stock at under $40 a piece. Rick was forced to sell because he was levered, meaning he had too much debt. He was too over his head. Charlie, Warren, and Rick were equally skilled at getting wealthy, but Warren and Charlie had the added skills of staying wealthy, which over time is the skill that matters most. Nassim Taleb put it this way: having an edge and surviving are two different things. The first requires the second. You need to avoid ruin at all costs. Applying the survival mindset to the real world comes down to appreciating three things. Number one, more than I want big returns, I want to be financially unbreakable. And if I'm unbreakable, I actually think I'll get the biggest returns because I'll be able to stick around long enough for compounding to work wonders. Remember, it's all about time. No one wants to hold cash during a bull market. They want to hold assets, own assets that go up a lot. You look and feel conservative holding cash during a bull market because you become acutely aware of how much money you're giving up by not owning the good stuff. Say cash earns 1% and stock return 10% a year. That 9% gap will gnaw at you every day. But if that cash presents you, I need some water. But if that cash prevents you from having to sell your stocks during a bear market, the actual return you earn on that cash is not 1% a year. It could be many multiples of that because preventing one desperate, ill timed stock sale can do more for your lifetime returns than picking dozens of big time winners. Compounding doesn't rely on earning big returns. Merely good returns sustained uninterrupted for the longest period of time, especially in times of chaos and havoc, will always win. So essentially, it's here saying compounding is really saying consistency is the name of the game. Don't get so hooked on the big stuff, the one hit wonders. No, consistently show up years and years and years and years and years over time. And that's not just investing, but in investing, in your business, in your career, in whatever you're, applying action to. Number two, planning is important, but the most important part of every plan is to plan on the plan, not going according to plan. That's so good because we all know that nothing goes according to our plan. What's the saying? You plan, God laughs. Financial and investment planning are critical because they let you know whether your current actions are within the realm of reasonable. But few plans of any kind survive their first encounter with the real world. If you're projecting your income, savings rate, and market returns over the next 20 years, think about all the big stuff that's happened in the last 20 years that no one could have foreseen. 9/11, a housing boom, a bust that caused busts that caused nearly 10 million Americans to lose their homes, a financial crisis that caused almost 9 million to lose their jobs, a record-breaking stock market rally that ensued, and a coronavirus that shakes the world as I write this. A plan is only useful if it can survive reality, and a future filled with unknowns is everyone's reality. A good plan doesn't pretend that this isn't true, it embraces it and emphasizes room for error. The more you need specific elements of a plan to be true, the more fragile your financial life becomes. If there's enough room for error in your savings rate that you can say, it'd be great if the market returns 8% a year over the next 30 years, but if it only does 4% a year, I'll still be okay with that. The more valuable your plan becomes. Many bets fail not because they were wrong, but because they were mostly right in a situation that required things to be exactly right. Room for error, often called margin of safety, is one of the most underappreciated forces in finance. It comes in many different forms: a frugal budget, flexible thinking, and a loose timeline. Anything that lets you live happily with a range of outcomes is different from being conservative. Conservative is avoiding a certain level of risk. Margin of safety is raising the odds of success at a given level of risk by increasing your chances of survival. Its magic is that the higher your margin of safety, the smaller your edge needs to be to have a favorable outcome. Number three, a barbelled personality, optimistic about the future, but paranoid about what will prevent you from getting to the future is vital. Optimism is usually defined as a belief that things will go well, but that's incomplete. Sensible optimism is a belief that the odds are in your favor and over time things will balance out to a good outcome, even if what happens is between is filled with misery. And in fact, you know it will be filled with misery. You can be optimistic that the long term growth trajectory is up and to the right, but equally sure that the road between now and then is filled with landmines and always will be. There will always be ebbs and flows, ups and downs in life. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. The idea that something can gain over the long run while being a basket case in the short run is not intuitive, but it's how a lot of things work in life. By age 20, the average person can lose roughly half the synaptic connections that they had in their brain at age 2 as inefficient and redundant neural pathways are cleared out. But the average 20-year-old is much smarter than the average 2-year-old. Destruction in the face of progress is not only possible, but an efficient way to get rid of excess. Imagine if you were a parent and could see inside of your child's brain. Every morning you notice fewer synaptic connections in your kid's head. You would panic. You would say, "This can't be right. There's loss and destruction here. We need an intervention. We need to go see a doctor." But you don't. What you are witnessing is the normal path of progress. Economies, markets, and careers often follow a similar path: growth amid loss. Here's how the US economy performed over the last 170 years. And essentially, it's just a chart of an upright, growth. Essentially saying, it's going to be ups and downs, but when you look at it from years, it's literally going like this. And it's from 1850 to 2010. But do you know what happened during this period? Where do we begin? 1.3 million Americans died while fighting 9 major wars. Roughly 99.9% of all companies that were created went out of business. Oh, that's crazy. From 1850 to 2010. 4 U.S. presidents were assassinated. 675,000 Americans died in a single year from a flu pandemic. 30 separate natural disasters killed at least 400 Americans each. 33 recessions lasted a cumulative 48 years. The number of forecasters who predicted any of those recessions rounds to zero. The stock market fell more than 10% from a recent high at 102 times. Stocks lost a third of their value at least 12 times. Annual inflation exceeded 7% in 20 separate years. The words economic pessimism appeared in newspapers at least 29,000 times, according to Google. Our standard of living increased 20-fold in these 170 years, but barely a day went by that lacked tangible reasons for pessimism. A mindset that can be paranoid and optimistic at the same time is hard to maintain because seeing things as black or white takes less effort than accepting the nuance. But you need short term paranoia to keep you alive long enough to exploit long term optimism. Jesse Livermore figured this out the hard way. He associated good times with the end of bad times. Getting wealthy made him feel like staying wealthy was inevitable and that he was invincible. After losing nearly everything, he reflected, "I sometimes think that no price is too high for a spectator to pay to learn that which will keep him from getting the swelled head. A great many smashes by brilliant men can be traced directly to the swelled head." So you gotta stay humble. You cannot get the big head and think that just because you've experienced a thing, you've got a lot of money, you've experienced some sort of outlier, that's just how it's going to stay. Like, no, it's essentially what I just said, an outlier. "It is an expensive disease," he said. everywhere to everybody. Next, we'll look at another way growth in the face of adversity can be so hard to wrap your head around. All right, so this was chapter 4 and chapter 5. I know at the beginning of this live I said that we were going to read chapter 4 through 6, but I am very thirsty and I need to go get me something to drink. So, what I'm going to do is end it right here. This is chapter 4 and chapter 5 of The Psychology of Money. Thank you so much for rocking with me. And in our next live session, I'll be doing chapter 6 and chapter 7. And we're just going to keep doing this live until we finish reading this book. I said at the beginning of this year that in 2025, this is going to be our year where we thrive financially. Last year was our last year being financially irresponsible. And what I know it takes is reading, listening, and applying what we learn. I know some people, they don't like to read books. You might be a little too busy where you don't want to read books. But if you just lock in with me and you listen to me read, there's still so much value that you can learn from what we will be reading together. So that was chapter 4 and chapter 5 of The Psychology of Money. Thank you so much for rocking with me during this time. And I will see you in the next video. Y'all have an amazing day. And let me go get some water. All right. Bye, y'all.